and welcome to another episode of Beginner Breakdown. My name is Alex Moellering, and I'm excited to be talking with you about our topic. And today we're going to be talking about improvement. How do we improve our pieces? And we're going to be focusing on a few in particular. The ones we're going to be looking at are all the pieces that attack in a straight line. So the rooks, the bishops, and the queen. The knight we're going to kind of touch on, and obviously kings and pawns will play a role, but we're really going to talk about how can we improve these pieces and put them to the best use. So something that's really important when you're playing a game of chess is to think about, one, developing, right? In the beginning, you want to get your pieces into the game. You don't want them sitting on the back row. But then as positions develop and change, it's important to recognize where do your pieces actually belong and how can we maneuver them into their best possible squares. So we're going to look at a bunch of examples tonight, and we're going to really focus on the ideas of long diagonals for the bishops and open files for the rooks, and then the queen, kind of a blend of those two. So here's a general example of improvement. This is we're going to be looking at a lot of different Grandmaster games. And this was a really useful game to demonstrate this kind of idea. We have a Sicilian defense, and there's a little bit of unusual kind of move order choices in the beginning, but eventually we're going to get into a fairly normal position. And I'm going to skip ahead a bit until we get to a really interesting position. Something I do want to note, again, we're not really going to talk too much about the knights today in terms of how to improve them. But the general thing with the knights is you want to find places where they're not going to be easily attacked by pawns. And you want them stuck in the enemy position, more centralized. But something that's just very kind of a quick and dirty rule for the knights that's really helpful for me is whenever you identify a square you want the knight to go, work backwards. So for example, if we're saying, well, I can't put my knight on c3 in this position, where should my knight go? Maybe it wants to go to b5, and maybe there's some threats over here. Maybe it wants to eventually end up on c2, where it can support us in the center, or even perhaps a b4 pawn push. And so we'll pick those squares and be like, okay, how could I get to this square? Well, I could go to a3, and then I could get my knight from there. And you can kind of work backwards, makes it a little easier. But okay, so we have this game, and we get to this position. And it's white's turn to move, and white decides to do a few kind of improving moves very quickly. So first they see this knight that had done a job on c2, right? White wanted to maybe potentially push forward here, but now without a c pawn and with our d pawn locked up, this knight isn't really doing anything. And so white decides that it's going to improve this knight, and it says, where would this piece like to be? What are some of the good squares? We can always move it here, but then we're just trading, and maybe that doesn't really accomplish too much. We can leave it where it is and try and put pressure here, but black is pretty well defended between the queen and the bishop. So this knight really isn't doing too much. And the player with white here, Kovalenko, decided this knight would be really annoying if it was on c5. It would attack this bishop, all of black's pawns. Yeah, and right as I was saying that, c5 seems juicy, right? It's attacking this bishop. There's no pawns that can kind of push it out of the way. And this dark squared bishop is going to have a harder time trading for it because there's so much in the way. You also probably wouldn't want to trade this bishop anyway. It needs to defend the king. So how do we get to c5? Well, let's work backwards. Candidate squares, well, our pawns are on d3 and e4. Looking at enemy territory generally isn't helpful because it's going to be hard enough to get there anyway. A4 is covered by this pawn. So b3 is really the only place we can get there. And how can we get to b3? Well, again, c5 obviously, but that doesn't help us. a5 also not really helpful. But we look and notice, oh wait, a1. And my knight actually can connect to a1. So white spends the next 3 moves, having seen that they want to put the knight on c5, playing knight a1. If you looked at this move in isolation, this would look so silly. The knight in the corner, that's like the worst place for it. You're not developed. You only control 2 spaces. But we're thinking longer term, right? We're thinking about where do we want this piece to go? Black continued with a5, knight b3, queen b6, and knight c5, defended by our rook here. And white's knight has transformed from something that on c2 really wasn't impacting the game So now it's a really good potential threat, right? We have potential forks on d7. This bishop might be a little loose in some variations. This knight's just kind of a monster on c5. It's a significant improvement. We're going to see a similar trend later on in the game. So black plays rook d8, and a few more moves continue. Did white think c5 before knight a3? Before knight a3, so that's all the way in the beginning. You might have eventually considered that, but it's too hard, and I can actually jump back in time real quick to that position. So this was the position in that point in the game when knight a3 was played. You sometimes have to wait and see how your opponent's going to develop and maneuver their pawns. It's a little too hard to predict, and they can often like play against you. Like if the idea was specifically to get this knight to c5, I mean, one, right now, sure, maybe we can attack this pawn, but black could also, if we spend a lot of time making that plan, we say, okay, I want to attack c5, so an easy way to do that would be to go to b3, and then we can go to d2 and get that way. Well, that's all well and good, and then maybe they just play pawn to b6 and defend, and they go for a whole different plan that invalidates our idea. So you don't want to think too far in the future that your opponent can kind of, they haven't made a commitment. But once it's a more settled position, like in this position, it's a lot harder to stop us getting knight to c5. I don't really think there's a good way to do it with this plan. It's just very quick. Maybe they could play here, but our bishop always could potentially take. We have our queen defending, so never mind. They don't really have a way to stop it. So you want to look for how committed your opponent is to the position, and if your plan of improvement, if they have any way they can very easily nullify it and just make you have wasted a bunch of time. It's a really good question. Okay, but let's jump back. So we get the knight to c5. A few more moves continue. Both sides kind of slowly improving their pieces, slowly improving the position. And again, white takes a look at their position. And let me ask you, of all the pieces here in white's camp, which one do you think is the least impactful? Which of white's pieces is doing the least, is contributing the least for our kind of army and our general kind of attack or defense or our general plan? Which of these pieces, and not the pawns, the pieces. So we got the two knights, the two bishops, the two rooks, or the queen. And yeah, somebody's already a little ahead. Don't drink and drive, doctor. But yes, so the plan is this bishop on d1 is really contributing nothing. This rook is well placed on the open file. This queen is nicely looking at the opponent's king. This bishop is kind of holding everything together, but potentially one day if this pawn moves, it can jump into h6, so it seems reasonable. And this rook as well on the file might help support some kind of pawn pushes towards the king. Our knight obviously is really good. So the one piece here that's not really pulling its weight is this bishop. And the question is, okay, where would I like it to go? Well, it doesn't really seem like it can do anything this way. Maybe we can look at getting it here. But white decides, instead of having to maneuver my knight somewhere, because that's already going to ask a lot, and then I have to waste time moving it back, instead, white plays this really nice idea. Bishop to c2, to b1, to a2, in order to get on this really nice diagonal. It's not quite the long diagonal, but it's very close, and just slowly improving. There's no threats in the position white needs to be concerned with, and so we have time to join the attack. And using this combination of this beautiful knight on c5 and this bishop, white actually is able to win this game. I'll show you really quick what the game looked like. Rook to a7, g4. So our king is pretty safe, even though the pawns are exposed. There's not any attack against us. So we can afford to push all of our pawns to them. King to h8, getting out of this dangerous diagonal, but it's just not quite enough. e5, looking to break everything open. And f takes. Knight back to e4, and intermezzo attacking the queen. So the queen moves, and now we recapture. And knight takes e5, and instead of recapturing the knight, we have the really nice knight from e to g5, making a checkmate threat. Also, this knight's just controlling a lot of very important squares. Okay, knight takes f3, this is check, we recapture. h6, stopping the checkmate threat, but white sees a really beautiful tactical sequence. I'm not going to ask you to look for it. If you want to, you can pause and always look at any position you want, assuming you're not watching this live. I guess you could, and then you'd have to refresh. But yeah, if you're watching this later on YouTube or on a Twitch recording, please feel free to always pause at any of these moments. But in the game, white played knight to f7 check. This is forking the king and queen, so black has to retake. Rook takes f7, queen to e8, and rook takes e7, the kind of the point of this whole maneuver. And it looks like this rook is not defended enough. It's only defended once, it's attacked twice. But the problem is, after rook takes c8, pinning the queen to the king, deflecting the queen away from this rook. Queen takes, and we win the rook back. Now we just have two bishops versus black's one. And black played a few more moves to try and cause some problems, queen to c2. But white has an answer to this fork in queen takes e6, defending the bishop and threatening checkmate. So there is no time to take on d2. Queen to d1 check and bishop to e1. White has successfully defended their position, and checkmate is basically unstoppable. White is defending just everything. This queen is a monster. It's on this beautiful diagonal, and white was able to take advantage of improving their pieces. So that's kind of the general idea here of improvement. Again, not expecting you to see everything from those Grandmaster games, but I think as we go through, it'll be helpful to understand, one, where are we going to, first identifying which piece of ours is not contributing, and also saying, how can we put pieces in really nice spots? And again, specifically looking at the bishops and the queen and the rooks. So we're going to start with the bishops. So the long diagonals are often where the bishops want to be. And there's really two long diagonals in the game. And they are the ones from each corner to the other corner. The reason these are so good for the bishops is because they control, one, critical central space. Two, the bishops can be sitting pretty far back and looking all the way in at their opponent's territory. And also, especially if you notice, long diagonals usually will intersect where the king's is castled, whether it's kingside or queenside. So these are excellent for placing the bishops either in the center, but you don't even need to. You can also place them kind of in this fianchetto style, something more close to home. And it's also really good for building batteries, right? So we want our pieces to work together in harmony. The queen can team up with either bishop, either in front or behind, to make a battery where both of them are attacking in the same line. And the rooks can team up with each other or with the queen. The two bishops sadly cannot team up in the same way because they are on different colors, but the fact that they cover different complexes also makes them valuable. Now this is an opening example that a lot of people will probably be familiar with, at least the idea of. It's quite popular at the beginner levels. This is actually called the Danish gambit. So after e4, e5, white plays d4, and this is going to be an extreme example, but in this opening, white gambits away 3 pawns in exchange for this black pawn. So we're going to be giving up material, and that's what a gambit actually is. It's just when you're giving up material in order to gain some positional advantage that will hopefully serve you later on to either win back more material or checkmate the king or something along those lines. So after black takes this pawn, white does not recapture. White instead plays c3, giving up another pawn. And again, white does not recapture. They play bishop c4. And this bishop is occupying a very nice diagonal. Again, it's not the long diagonal, but it is still very good. And this one in particular is really dangerous for black because of the f7 weakness. These two pawns on the f files are very weak because only the king defends them. So having a piece that can kind of laser focus in on that weak target is going to be really helpful. Black accepts our third pawn. This is probably a bit too much. Probably better for black not to take all of these and just start developing, because even though even though white loses 2 pawns net, this is a really dangerous position. You can see our bishop on b2 occupies the long diagonal. This bishop on c4 attacks the weak f7 square and kind of harmonizes with this b2 bishop to just put massive amounts of pressure on the king side for black. So this is already a really dangerous position. Objectively, probably black is slightly better, but it's still very dangerous. And it's quite easy for black to fall into a trap. For example, say something like bishop to b4 check, knight to c3, knight to f6. Black is now trying to cover their bases in development, get their king castled, and just start fighting, because if they can trade a bunch of these pieces, then the material difference is going to add up even more. Here, white plays knight to e2. Probably not the best move, but it is setting a very clever trap, because black has pinned this knight to the king, so the knight cannot move. And if you remember our video on pins, one of the things about a pin is a pinned piece does not protect, right? So this knight normally would be protecting e4, but because it is pinned, it actually cannot move. So if something were to take e4, like this knight, we cannot recapture with our knight. It's actually an illegal move, because then our king would be in check. Unfortunately for black, this is all part of white's plan. White castles, knight takes, bishop takes, bishop takes. And black has managed to win another pawn, meaning they're up 3 points in this whole position. But they're now too weak to actually stop our threats. Our bishops are too monstrous on these diagonals. And in the game, black castles kingside here. But because there's 0 development and they walk right into where our pieces are attacking, they probably castle in order to get off of this dangerous open file, right? If they don't, our rook is going to cause them quite a serious problem as well. So they castle, but unfortunately in this position, we can harmonize our bishops and our queen to find a winning attack. So see if you can find the best move here for white. Again, as always, feel free to pause the video if you are watching this later. And if you're here live, as always, in the classroom or on the stream, feel free to leave a comment with your idea. So what should white do here to gain the advantage of their beautiful developed bishops and black's lack of development? I think there are 2 moves that seem fairly obvious, but one of them is winning and the other one is still probably about even. So see if you can find the best move. Anyone have any ideas? Queen d5 suggested. Queen d5 is not a bad move. Mantari D. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce your name, but so Queen d5 is nice. We're kind of making a battery with this bishop. The only downside is the pawn we're attacking, this f7 pawn. It used to be the weak one. Now that black is castled, the rook is an extra defender. So f7 is actually a little bit safer. So d5 is not quite strong enough just because black is a little bit defended there. For dessert, queen to g4 is the right idea. Queen to d4 also looks tempting because both of these moves, g4 and d4, both attack this pawn on g7, which is only defended by the king, and so we're forming a battery. But g4 is better, because if we go to d4 right away, black can try and survive with queen to f6, and we'll have a nice attack into their castle, but we're also still down material, so we have to prove that we can earn it. So if we start with queen to g4, this queen f6 move just isn't possible, because it's just a free queen. And there's actually no good way for black to proceed here. They can't block our attack with the f-pawn because our bishop is pinning it to the king. And if they play something like g6, we can, as for dessert said, switch over to d4. Now queen f6 is not a move because the pawn does not defend. And there's no good way to stop queen to g7. There's actually really the only way is to play queen to f6, sacrifice it, and then you only just delay it a move. So again, a pretty extreme example, maybe objectively not the best way to play, but a very strong, assertive way. I didn't start exactly with the Danish gambit, but I started with similar ideas with the Scotch gambit of trading a little bit of material for some rapid development, attacking chances, and especially with these bishops like this, it's quite a monstrous thing to face. So bishops on these long diagonals, you always want to keep an eye out for. One of the kind of additional benefits that can be really helpful both for your game to play, but also to avoid, is the idea that the bishop on the long diagonal can sometimes be hard to see, if that makes sense. Like pieces kind of sitting out in the center are a little more obvious, but a bishop just fianchettoed off to the side is not so obvious sometimes. It's easy to overlook its attack. And there are a lot of traps based around this kind of idea. So one, for example, comes out of the Grob opening. This is not something I would recommend you play, but it is instructive for this example. It starts with 1 to g4, which I believe is objectively the worst move white can play on turn 1. Again, would not recommend, but there are some tricky ideas. So let's say black plays d5, saying, well, you put a pawn on g4. I would like to take it for free and punish you. White plays bishop g2, and black happily eats the pawn. And now white continues with this tricky idea of pawn to c4. And if you're not careful, you might be thinking, oh, well, you gave up one pawn. Maybe you're just not a good player. You'll give up a second pawn. The problem here, if you have not spotted it yet, is that white actually can play bishop now takes b7 on this very long diagonal. The pawn was pinned, in a way, to that square. So by taking, we are now trapping our rook. After the bishop takes, there's nothing we can do to save this rook. It can't move, and the bishop has it trapped. So keeping out an idea, or keeping an eye out for this type of idea can be helpful. What's funny is, in this particular position, black is actually still better after knight d7 and takes. Black has a slight advantage here. So yeah, this is a Sanders approved trap, but still, this is not something I would recommend playing because it's very bad. But the trap is legitimate, this idea, just not in this particular opening. So some other examples where that might come in. One that's maybe a little more familiar is in the Queen's Gambit. This is a very old trap, but for people who aren't familiar, Queen's Gambit, d4, d5, and then c4. And it's a gambit because, again, we are sacrificing some material for an advantage. There's nothing defending this pawn, but the idea is often if you take, then we're going to have more control in the center. Your d-pawn was doing an important job controlling the center. And we can later play e3 and win this pawn back. And one of the reasons the Queen's Gambit isn't really a gambit is because it's actually problematic to try and hold on to this pawn. For example, let's say you play b5 and say, okay, well, now you just can't take it. I have an extra pawn, so shouldn't black be better? Well, maybe, but there are some problems. If pawn to a4, black now has a bit of an issue. If you play pawn to a6, I believe we will just take, and you can't take back because your rook will hang. Again, we've kind of opened a file, so we will talk more about the open files and the rooks in a moment. So some people will say, well, I can't do that, so I'm just going to play c6. But now we can still take, and it is white to move and punish black for trying to hang on to this extra material. What should white do in this position? Audi11, welcome in, longtime chess fan. We are glad to have you. Any idea for this position, white to move, and black has tried to punish, black has tried to, punish white for giving up this c-pawn by holding on to it, but unfortunately this is not going to work, and Emile, I'm not sure exactly how to say your name in the chat, has spotted it. A few other people coming in right after. The problem here is queen to f3. Did this as black in a 15-minute game? Well, if you haven't seen this idea, it can seem, well, why would you just give me a pawn? The problem is now our queen enters this long diagonal, and actually, funny enough, there's no way to save the rook here. Even though we have so many pieces, there's nothing you can do. If you block with a knight, it's not defended. If you block with the bishop, it's not defended. Same with the queen. There's nothing we can do to defend this rook, so we're just going to lose it. It is quite unfortunate. I guess you could play like bishop here and then knight over and lose the bishop instead, but you are losing some material because of this weakness on the long diagonal. Now we're going to look at a few, well, I'm actually going to skip ahead. So I have some examples from games from long diagonals, but we're going to switch to open files because I want to make sure I kind of cover all my bases here. And then we'll come back and look at some master games with examples from both. So keep all the long diagonal information and the bishops in your mind. But now I want to talk about open files. So rooks belong on the open files. This is something you may have heard. This is kind of an axiom in the chess world, but you might not understand what the idea is. At the most basic level, well, before I explain, what is an open file? If you're not familiar with the terminology, an open file just means, so the files are the vertical columns on the chessboard They're labeled A through H. The ranks are the horizontals. So it's 1 through 8, all these horizontal lines, and rooks belong in the open files. So an open file is any vertical column, any file, where there are no pawns from either side. So in this case, white has a rook on the open E file, black has a rook on the open D file. If there is just one pawn on a file, that is a semi-open file. So this rook on B1 is attacking our pawn on B7, but there are no white pawns in its way. This would be a semi-open file. And we can imagine if our rook on D8 was on B8 instead, it would also be on a semi-open file, just defending. And then a closed file, not a term we use really that often, but is anyone where there are pawns of both colors in the way. Rooks really would like to be on the open files, and perhaps you can intuitively understand why, because it gives them a lot more mobility. They can make lots of threats, they can invade, and if they're stuck behind pawns, it's not so good. If they're attacking pawns on semi-open files, that can be okay, but usually open files is going to be the best. Which means we can look at positions like this. I believe I've looked at this example before in my like kind of introduction to the rooks, but this is useful as well here. It's white to move and play the best move, even though the position is totally equal in terms of the material. So both sides have 8 pawns. We have not traded any yet. And both sides have 2 rooks and their king. But because it's white to move, and because of the particulars of this position, white actually has a nice advantage if you find the right idea. And Fand B. Welch, not sure exactly, again, if that's how I say your name. I apologize to anyone if I mispronounce how you intend your name. AlphaZero loves open bishop diagonals. I actually have an example of a game that AlphaZero used that we might take a look at in a moment. But in this position, white to move, how can we, and if you're having some trouble with this, the basic idea is we have our pieces and we want to improve them. So with the first example, we looked at the knight kind of traveling around the board to A2, or sorry, to A1 and to B3 and to C5, and then the bishop rerouting slowly. Sometimes improving a piece means moving that piece into a better position, and sometimes it means moving other pieces to create room. In this case, as Maumaramu, again, apologize if I mispronounce, has the right idea by taking this pawn. We are improving our rook on E1 by attempting to open this file. And black is actually in a bit of a bind here. If you don't take back, then I just win a pawn. But the computer actually says the best move is to play E5. Accepting that they have given up this pawn, we can try and play C4 and hold on to it potentially, or maybe make other threats. But black says opening this file is too dangerous. They are willing to give up the pawn. If you just take with the rook, well, I just take this one back. And if you take with the pawn, then I invade. So rooks belong on open files, but they also belong on the 7th or the 2nd rank. So the horizontal line, one space above the edge of the board, you want to be on the one closer to your opponent, because that's going to be the attacking one. What is the reason for this? Well, it's kind of twofold. One, the pawns all start here, and so usually there's going to be a few pawns left on this file. We can already see if we play rook to e7, we are attacking this free pawn on g7 and this pawn near the king on c7. The other reason is with enough pressure and especially help from other pieces, you can keep an opponent's king locked into this rank, which can be really unfortunate, right? Maybe you can set up back rank threats, or you can just have a winning king and pawn endgame where you can keep their king locked away long enough to activate yours and win. So using the open files to invade your opponent's position on the 7th or the 2nd rank is a very effective strategy, just to kind of see how dangerous this can be. Black, let's say, needs to defend this pawn and plays rook to g8. We now can double our rooks. This is a battery, right? We have 2 pieces that attack in the same direction on the same line. And this stops our opponent from putting a rook on e8 to challenge us, right? Before, they would have loved to try and challenge us and stop us from having total dominance of this file. Now it's too late. If you do this now, I will just take and win. So you cannot do that. So instead, let's just say, again, they make another move. something like maybe rook, yeah, just to f8. It's hard to say what exactly is good for black here because we're so strong. And we can slowly try and improve, maybe something like rook d7, and they defend. And we now invade with 2 rooks on the 7th rank. Again, black has not been playing optimally here in this example, but these 2 rooks now, this doubled rooks on the 7th rank, are basically game ending. Even though the material is equal here, the computer evaluates at a low depth that this is +7 for white. More than a rook, almost as much as a queen, just because of where our rooks are placed in comparison to our opponents. Ours are attacking all of the valuable squares and creating major threats against the king, and our opponents are stuck defending on these closed files. So that's the idea with open files. Now, let's jump back and we're going to look and see how long diagonals and open files can work together or independently to gain a lot of pressure. And I mentioned the AlphaZero game, so I'm not going to show the whole game. It's a very long game, but a few years back, AlphaZero played Stockfish in a whole bunch of games. And this position is actually one of my favorites. I'm not going to ask you to predict the moves of these supercomputers, but in the game, Stockfish played knight to d7. It looks like it's sacrificing the queen, but it's also discovered attacking the queen. And we can notice that the position is not equal. Materially, black has 3 points advantage, actually similar to the Danish gambit example in the first case. But look at white's bishops. These 2 pieces are just disgustingly monstrous. They are attacking right through the enemy camp, hitting incredibly relevant squares. White's rook and queen are also quite active, while black's are a little more passive. So white does not want to trade material here. They have an incredibly advantageous attacking position, and so white retreats. Rook to f6, and black is now giving up this rook for a bishop, and white says, no way, my bishop is way more valuable on the long diagonal than your rook. White just pushes this pawn. Queen to e7 unpinning, so now the rook's going to move if you don't take it. But instead, AlphaZero decides, I'm not going to take it with the bishop, I'm going to take it with the rook, because my bishop is too valuable. Okay, so knight takes, pawn to f5, using the second bishop to start striking at these pawns in coordination with our rook on the semi-open file. Black plays queen to e3, desperately trying to trade some material to lessen the power of this attack. And white now sees it can simplify into a winning endgame, so plays pawn takes pawn, queen takes queen. We have an intermezzo before we recapture the queen. We take with check, king to f7, rook takes queen, knight takes pawn, because if you don't, I'm probably going to promote or trade for something worse. So knight takes pawn, and bishop takes knight. And in the resulting position, white is up in material. We have our bishop pair against 1 bishop, and even though black has 2 extra pawns, one of them is doubled. This bishop is basically a tall pawn, and white went on to win this game quite soundly. So again, the point is less about understanding the precise moves and the play at this level, but more just to see how powerful these bishops and rooks, when they are well placed, can really be at digging into your opponent. So putting the bishops on the long diagonals, pointing them towards your opponent's castle and their important pieces, and having rooks fulfill a similar role. Okay, let's look at a few kind of examples here. This is kind of a really fun example because this comes from a Grandmaster game where both players missed the best move. And white here plays d4, knight f6, c4, e6. We have a Nimzo Indian defense, g3, looking to put the bishop on the long diagonal. As we said, this is very strong. c5, kind of invading in the center, d5. And this is all kind of fairly normal opening theory. b5 pressing forward on the queen side now that there's not a lot of control here. Bishop g2, putting the bishop on line and potentially attacking this rook. d6 to stop it. And I believe we have a trade of pawns here. Trade. Knight to h3. Again, thinking white here is not making the obvious move, knight to f3. They have some ideas of where this knight wants to belong, so they're moving it here first. Bishop d6 to stop the pawn from invading further into the position and discovered attacking our rook. and castle. And in this position, white made a mistake. They missed something and just decided to castle. And black, who was no less than Garry Kasparov, right, a grandmaster at the ultimate levels of play, a world champion, also castled. But there was a move here that's like +5, just crushing. So see if you can be a little better than Kasparov. Now we have the benefit of hindsight and knowing that this is a puzzle that can be solved. But see if you can find a move that both Kasparov and his 2700 rated opponent failed to find in their game. How can we punish white for simple play? And yeah, Fritz has the right idea. Bishop to e5, taking the long diagonal, attacking the rook. And take a close look at this position and you realize this rook is trapped. You can't move. All the pawns are gone. You can't block. If knight blocks, I take it. If bishop blocks, I take it. This rook is just trapped. There's just nothing that white can do here to save the rook. And both of these players just missed this move. It's kind of remarkable. But again, something to tell you that, you know, even really good players can make mistakes. And you always want to keep an eye out for potential misplays, even from really good opponents, by taking advantage of putting your pieces on really good squares. If pawn d6, I think, is your idea. So yeah, they can discover to attack our rook, but the problem is we can just like play rook b8, moving it out of the way, and they can't really make any further threats. Eventually we might try and retake this pawn, but there's still nothing they can do about their own rook. Okay, another example very similar to this from a high-level game. In this example, the player, David Bronstein with the white pieces, did find the right continuation. d4, knight f6, c4, g6. This is more of a King's Indian style defense. And this very opening, right, is all about putting the bishop on the long diagonal. You'll see opponents do this, or maybe you play this way. And it's always important in these openings to remember the pressure that this piece exerts, and to keep that in mind as you play. And if your opponent has it, to watch out for it, because it can be deadly. But we get to a relatively normal position, and here black decides, I'm going to push forward with c5. I have a nice pawn chain. I would like to fight white in the center of the board. And this looks like a very good idea. In most positions, this is a very reasonable plan. In this particular one, white has a nice way to punish black for this move. So again, always feel free to pause and try and find the best continuation for white here. How can we punish black for overextending slightly and not taking care of some of the really important parts of their position? What do you notice? Yes, so again, we have some really smart people in the chat here tonight. Starting with e5, a forcing move, right? Attacking the knight, forcing it to respond. And the problem that black has is this is a forcing move, so we're making a big threat. You have to deal with this, but after the knight moves, we have cleared this space for the bishop. And again, the rook is stuck. It's totally trapped. You can't block, I'll just take you. It's just gone. All the pawns are unable to do anything. So again, a very common trap, really useful to keep an eye out for. Again, it's not always you're going to get the rook trapped so nicely, but keeping an eye on how we can utilize our long diagonals, how you can use forcing moves to complement them, super, super helpful. Okay, this one is not going to be so much a trap, but more just kind of a general game. So this one was from 1924. It was Reti versus Yates. And in this position, black played the move h6, which was a bit of a mistake because if you notice, white has a queen on a1 and a bishop on b2. White actually has both of the long diagonals. This light square diagonal is kind of contested between these two bishops, but we have total dominance here over the dark square diagonal, a nice battery. The queen is maybe a little inactive, but we can make up for that by putting extra pressure on this diagonal. h6 is not so good because black really had to do something to close this down. And now white can press forward with the move d4. And we're going to either get control of e5 or of d4. So if you take, for example, I can just play knight takes. This battery will reactivate at some relevant moment and cause a lot of problems for black. So instead, black tried to close it down, but it's a little too late because now knight to e5, attacking too many valuable pieces, basically forcing black to trade and allowing d takes e5. Now we have invaded their position. Our bishop and queen just have a chokehold over this pawn, so there's nothing you can do to really fight against it. And it is now exerting pressure into black's camp. So just kind of a total dark square domination here. And I'll show these moves because they can be somewhat instructive. Knight backs off to h7, looking, I believe, to eventually jump into g5 to reactivate. f4, defending the pawn again, allowing this en passant move. If you're not familiar, it is not an illegal move or a magic trick, but if a pawn moves 2 spaces, obviously on its first turn, then the very next turn, if it lands next to an opponent's pawn, that pawn can act as if it had only gone 1 and capture it. This is a real rule. Okay, pawn takes back, knight to g5, but we just get f4 again. Knight to h3 check, king to h1, pawn to d4, bishop takes. There's really nothing much else to do. The idea was to maybe open up some pressure on this diagonal, but there's not really anything you can do. Rook from 8 to d8, and here Reti plays a really energetic move. Feel free to look for it with a pause if you would like, but it's kind of hard to find. Reti plays rook takes c6, giving up one of these doubled rooks in order to now gain control over both of these diagonals. Right, so after pawn takes, these bishops just dominate the board. Bishop takes c6, skewering the queen and the rook. Knight to f2 check, a bit of an intermezzo, king to g2. And queen takes bishop, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes rook. And when the dust has settled, white has 2 extra pawns and still a slight positional advantage. Should be an easy time finding the win. The game just continued in 2 more moves, rook to d2, king to f3. And here black resigned. There's just too many threats in the position. It's pretty untenable to play. But again, we can see the power of looking for taking control on those long diagonals, those open files. So I think this is a good example. Let me share one more on the long diagonals, and then we'll switch over a little bit to the open files. In this position, it is white to move. This one I'll let you take some time and put kind of your puzzle thinking cap on and see if you can find the best move for white, keeping in mind how can we use our long diagonals, our open files, to punish our opponent. See what you can find. You can certainly try, again, don't drink and drive, doctor, but yeah, seems like some people are seeing the right ideas here. This king is very weak, even though black is up, I believe, the exchange. Our pieces are really primed for this attack. So how can we make full use of it? D7, so I'm thinking rook. So yeah, knight d7 is going to fork. This is not bad, but we're not looking just to get some material back here. We're looking to win the game. Yeah, knight g6 similarly is going to get us a fork, but I believe just king to g8, and black can try and fight on and survive. Probably still not going to be pretty, but yeah. Knight g6 is, I think, fine. Okay, there's a lot of good moves here, but the best way is actually there's a forced mate in 3. All right, a few people are starting to see the idea, so I'm going to walk it through with you. So we want to open up this really beautiful bishop on the long diagonal. And the only problem, well, there's 2 problems. 1, our knight's in the way. 2, this pawn is in the way. If this pawn were to move by maybe a capture, then we could bring in our knight somewhere and make a discovered check and a double check and try and win the game that way. But if we take with the pawn, maybe they can like push this one and our pawn is now in the way. So instead, queen takes h6, sacrificing the queen, because now after pawn takes it is, if you just play here, then I can just go here with mate. So you have to take knight to f7 check. Our bishop covers h7. Our bishop is now activated here, so it is a double check. You have no time to take the knight. King only move is to g8, and now knight takes h6, check, mate. We control all of the critical squares with our bishops, and our knight delivers the killer blow. Again, only possible because of how much control our bishops are exerting on their king. Just incredibly powerful resource here. All right, let's look at some open file examples. In this game, this is Meduna versus Polanek in 1979. And black here has some control over the b file. Our queen is well placed guarding this b file. Maybe we can have ideas of doubling up. And this is actually exactly how black starts. Even though the material is equal, we play rook to b8. White plays bishop to d1, trying to reduce some of our control of this file by eliminating the bishops. Unfortunately, this is not going to be enough, so we exchange the light squared bishops. And now we want to invade with our queen and make a lot of threats. So queen to b3, attacking a3 and d3. White needs to defend, so rook to a1, holding on to the pawn. And I'll put this one to you. What do you think black should do here to continue trying to make progress? Material is equal. We have pretty command and control of the open file. So see if you can remember, when we have an open file, what should our next goal be? It's okay if you don't see the whole line. There's a lot more to this game, but let's just think one step at a time. How do we improve our pieces and our position? What is the general purpose or one of the main benefits to having the open file? So queen to c3 is suggested. This is a really interesting move. I think the problem you might face is if we trade, maybe our pawn on c3 is going to be too weak. I mean, we can play rook here to defend, but I do think white will probably be able to forcibly win that pawn back. I'm just not confident it's going to be safe there. So slightly better is, as a few people are suggesting, queen to b2. One of the main things we want with the open file is to invade on the 2nd or 7th rank, and here we are doing just that. If white takes, we can just invade right away. So instead, white plays rook to a2, but we still are happy to make this trade, because now black's only heavy piece, our only rook, is still enough on its own to control this whole file. So we invade with rook to b3. Rook has to go back to a2, defending this pawn. And notice that our rook is just much more active, right? White is stuck on this closed file, defending a single rook pawn. Ours is incredibly active. We can move back to the defense if we have to. We can invade farther and attack this knight. We're already making several attacks and multiple threats. So our rook is very active, very powerful. And now it's just a question. Oh yeah, Just Jojo, welcome in. Thanks for the raid. We're talking about open files, long diagonals, and how to improve our pieces. So in this position, we decide that our rook is doing really well, but we need to punish white's pieces for being so passive, and we need to bring our other piece into the game. And the question is, where does this knight want to go? I think there's a few kind of candidate places, but one we might consider I'm not sure exactly where we want it, but the way that black decided to go was black said, I'm going to go knight to d7 in order to get to b6, in order to get to a4, and potentially to get to c3, or also maybe just to control b2. So this knight on a4 is going to become a very powerful piece, and this is the plan. So knight to d7. White's pieces are all tied down, so they try and activate the king to try and help. Knight to b6, king to e2. Knight to a4, king to d2, and so the king has joined the fray, It's just not quite enough. Here, despite the reduced material, white's king is still kind of unsafe, and so actually black finds a really nice move in this position. Black actually plays rook to b1 with a very interesting threat. So let's say white just pushes a pawn here and tries to stall. What is our threat in this position? Black to move and cause white some serious problems. Okay, a lot of people think knight c3, and this makes sense to me. It's an excellent square. We're attacking the rook, but there's actually more than that. What's the idea with knight c3? Yeah, you win the rook. So knight c3 is brutal because we're not just threatening this rook, but notice that white's king now, having walked close to our active pieces, is put himself in a lot of danger. Our pawn controls this square, the knight now controls this square, the rook controls everything on this back rank, and there's actually nothing you can do to save this rook. If you leave it, I'm just going to take it, and the only other safe square, you can't go to a1 or b2 because of my rook, so the only safe square is rook to c2. But you cannot do that because now the king has one less square, and that one square makes all the difference with rook to d1, checkmate. So our piece just being so active, white saw this threat and played instead knight to c2. But again, black is just kind of going to slowly improve their pieces and eventually just start winning some of this material. And it leads to just kind of a pretty ending. White tries to get some counterplay by sacrificing this knight and creating some passed pawns. It's just not quite enough. And I'm going to show you the rest of this game just because it's kind of pretty. But black, again, sort of traps white in a mating net. Even though white's pawns are very close to promotion, white is just in time with knight to d1, rook to b3, check, king to h3, and here, white to move. White played one more move and black resigned, and the move was f5. Controlling g4, kind of freeing up the knight from having to do that. And now the knight can jump into g4, followed by rook to h2, checkmate. And there's not really a good answer here. If you just push the pawn, then this is basically unstoppable. And if you play g4 to try and get out of that attack, then pawn takes, king h4, rook f3, again slowly kind of keeping this mating net alive, king to h5, king to g7, again the threat is rook to h3, and there's not really anything you can do. So again, I no need to worry too much about the intricacies of the end of that game, but we saw all the way from the beginning of this position that we went from basically an even game in terms of material. Black just had the benefit of this open file and really clamped down on it, was able to slowly invade, attack a lot of these weaknesses, and make some really good progress. Okay, a few more examples that I think would be helpful. This is a bit of a kind of puzzle. So it's white to move, and using the benefit of how our rooks are placed, we can cause some serious problems here for black. See if you can come up with the idea. Yeah, Dr. Drink and Drive, you might be a little too good for this class. You're picking these up really quick. Noticing that our rook on the G file attacks this king, and it's not technically an open file, but because our rook has been lifted, this is another strategy you can sometimes use, is to, if you can't get rid of the pawns, you can maneuver your rook up and slide it over in order to take advantage of an attack like this. And in this case, that's exactly what's going on. And we notice that with our bishop and rook together, we can make some serious threats against this king. But we can actually start with rook takes e2 to lure the queen here. And now we see there is a deadly discovered threat. Rook takes g7, king takes, bishop takes, and black resigns because you will be losing the queen. So just kind of an interesting example here. but I have some that I'm hoping will be maybe a little more instructive. Okay, this is a short but sweet one. So notice, so this comes from Barksay versus Michalchison, again, probably mispronouncing some of these names, in 1983. And let's just take a look at this position and notice that white has really an excellently placed queen. It's occupying both the long A1 to H8 diagonal on these dark squares. It's also really nice and centrally placed, you know, controlling just good space in general. Pieces generally like to be in the center because they can impact more of the board and maneuver to which part of the board they need to, but the queen in general just really loves it. Okay, in the game, black here played a mistake. Black played queen to b6, which looks kind of very natural, you know, opening up this square for the rook potentially, looking to start making threats against white's castle, or even maybe trying to invade somewhere like this. The problem with this move is it actually allows the queen to become a target and, in a way, an accomplice in white's attack against the black kingdom here. So I'm going to share the first move here with you. In the game, white played knight to a4, attacking the queen. And let's take a second to see where this queen can actually go. So not a lot of squares, right? Our queen, again, so centrally placed, covers all of these options. You can't go to c5 because of the knight. You can't go to either b5 or a6 because of our bishop. You can't go to a5 because of our queen. So these are all out. So that you can't go to c7 because of the queen. You can't go to d8 because of the rook. So that only leaves queen to c6, queen to b4, or queen to f2. These are the only safe squares we can move the queen. If you go to like f2, say, we can just attack it with the rook. This is not so good. I believe this queen is, I think this queen is trapped. And similarly, if you go to b4, we can just lift this rook up again, and the queen is not doing so well. So in the game, queen to c6 was the move that was played. And here, white played a really brilliant move. White played bishop to b5, defended by the queen, because again, we are forcing the queen now to actually take our pawn. This is one of the few examples you might see of someone just willingly giving up a pawn, but actually not just willingly doing it, forcing their opponent to take one of your pieces, other than like a sacrifice. And that's kind of what this is. This is a sacrifice of material. This is a gambit, because now, without this pawn, we have created a semi-open file on the g file. Rook from h to g1. We're not afraid of them taking this pawn and just making another open file, which is what happens. Queen takes h2, the only thing they can really do. And now we just have way too much pressure here. It's white to move and play the best move. So see what you can find. Ted Bradley, welcome to the chat. I have seen you in the chat here before, and Pumpkin the Cat as well. Welcome back. Glad to have some familiar faces here in the chat. And yes, the move here is to just capture on f6, because now with this semi-open file, this pawn is pinned. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes, queen takes, and white wins a piece for 2 pawns, but also notice that these pawns were actually kind of in our way. Without them, we have full reign to just demolish this king, and this game is over. So that is basically all the time we have, but I do want to thank you for coming into this video series and this lecture tonight. The kind of takeaway I want to give you is consider how your pieces are placed and where you should put them, especially at the beginning. But even throughout the course of the game, it's never too late to improve your pieces. And the bishops and the queen love these long diagonals, or just aiming towards your opponent's king, opening up files as well for the rooks, invading on the 7th. These are incredibly powerful tools to add to your arsenal, and they will help you make a lot of progress in your chess. I certainly hope so. That is the goal here. That is all the time that we have for me, but please stick around as Grandmaster Josh Sheng has a really exciting Grandmaster's Choice lecture coming up. So thank you for coming, and hope to see you again soon.